Chapter 1 Christmas. "Tell me of this Christmas again," Ozer barked as he leaned forward in the carved stump that served as his throne. Xander sighed and cupped his face in his hands. Much like the fat, frigid flakes that had begun to sink into the barren branches of the forest, Christmas and its heavy memories were growing harder and harder to ignore. And while Xander was not only content, but outright determined to ignore the encroaching holiday, it was becoming painfully evident that neither his memories nor the company he kept would allow such a callous indulgence. Not that he needed reminding. Even if he had hardened enough to ignore the sprouting seeds of excitement in his comrades, the occasional supply run out of the Therion camp and into the city, with its bright, invasive lights and eager, consumer-driven bustle, served as enough of a reminder. On those outings, as he watched the chaotic and stressful scurrying of his former species, Xander was all the more thankful that he was no longer bound to their ways. Though this Christmas would mark his second since becoming a vampire, the holiday, like all others, had long since lost its meaning. As a child, the greatest gift Xander could have been granted was a day free from the tortures of his misery-hungry and insatiable auric vampire of a stepfather, a gift that, holiday or not, was a rarity. Later, after his mother had been murdered at the hands of his abuser, and he'd been sent to live with his grandmother, Christmas became a shadowed mockery of what he was certain it was supposed to have been. No matter how much his widowed grandmother tried, every gift he was given felt like a failed attempt to patch the shattered remains of his childhood. And though that previous year's Christmas, spent in the company of his late father's white tiger companion, Trepus, and his vampire mentor, Marcus, who, while sporting a Santa-style hat, had given him the gift of a shattered collarbone during a training session, had brought with it an awkward comfort. Marcus's death, several months earlier, had put a sour tone on the memory. However, as he'd learned the previous year when he'd finally put a bullet in the brain of the bastard responsible for destroying his childhood, vengeance did nothing to squelch the pain of loss. And though his lesson had been well kept in Xander's heart, killing Marcus's murderer, Lennox, had reawakened his understanding of just how futile his efforts had been. And at what cost? Aside from Marcus and his pride, Lennox had robbed him of his home and his purpose, robbed him of his motivation, his legacy. And, as if that had not been enough, Lennox had robbed him of her, Estella. Her name had become a constant fixture in the back of his mind, keeping him ever mindful of how he'd allowed his closest, dearest friend and lover to come to harm, to be taken and subjected to the diabolical plot of the scornful Lennox, and, finally, to be bitten, to be turned, and left to fester on the undeniable fact that Xander had failed to protect her and, in doing so, condemned her to a life that demanded the pain and death of others. Day after day, Xander dreamed of her, and day after agonizing day, he saw the pain and anguish on her face when she'd awoken to discover the fate that had befallen her. "You promised me it would be all right." If there had been any hint of holiday cheer in him before, there was no doubt in his mind that those 7 words would have eradicated them over and over again. Xander scowled and looked down. "You promised me it would be all right." Hearing the ghostly vow resound in his mind, Xander felt a tear well in his right eye, a blood-stained orb, courtesy of Lennox, and moved to wipe away the moisture before it had a chance to spring free and roll down his cheek. He shook his head and let out a misty sigh. Fucking Christmas. Ozer cocked his head in confusion and leaned forward expectantly. Christmas, he pressed. Will you tell me more of this custom? Dragging his focus from the past, Xander shifted his gaze to the Therion's pack leader. Being a solitary and isolated pack, the Therions that he was staying with had no notion of the human holiday. To them, the concept of a scheduled festivity was unheard of, their focus being on a successful hunt or a won battle over their territory, and they approached all celebrations, no matter the occasion, with vast amounts of meat, guttural songs, and clumsy dances. It was no surprise that they had caught on to Thanksgiving with relative ease. Xander didn't mind, however, and even appreciated the escape from the old ways. The Therions had accepted him when he had no other place to go, nobody else to rely on. That meant a lot to him, especially since it was more in their nature to shift into hulking beasts at the slightest sign of trouble and eviscerate the problem. And even more so, it was because of him that their leader was missing an arm. Despite this, the wound that Ozer had suffered during a battle against Lennox and an army of mind-enslaved mythos creatures, the same battle that had marked Marcus's last, didn't seem to bother the beaming Therion. Even then, his worn and weathered face was as bright and cheery as the holiday decor as it had been the first time the young vampire had mentioned it in passing. Though the eager and childlike expression was an awkward sight when plastered on the face of the aged shapeshifter, a face that normally wore the stern appearance of what Xander imagined a war-hardened grandfather might look like, Xander was unable to appreciate the humor. Sighing, he looked away from Ozer and watched as Trepus and a few of the younger Therions darted about in the snow a short distance away, trying to think of yet another way to describe the holiday to the impatient elder. Finally, finding himself at a total loss of trying to fake it, he shook his head. It's just another stupid human tradition. Nothing worth celebrating is stupid. Ozer bared his teeth as he chuckled, and Xander couldn't be certain if it was a threatening gesture or not. Xander rolled his eyes. If you say so. He watched his white tiger let out an excited growl as it rolled in the snow. So, why do they celebrate this day? Xander shrugged his left shoulder absently. Well, it happens around this time of year, in the month of December. December. The Therion played with the word. Xander nodded. Yeah, December. Fun word, right? He couldn't help but smirk. So, anyway, every year they have this one day near the end of the month when they get together with friends and family and give each other gifts. The Therion frowned. Why? Xander shrugged. Because they're greedy bastards who either want more shit or want credit for giving the best shit. The two laughed. But you were once human, once just as greedy as the rest of them, yes? Why do you not like this Christmas now? Ozer asked. Was the shit you were given not to your liking? Xander shook his head. No, nothing like that. If there was anything my life never fell short on, it was an abundance of shit. It was just, he sighed. It's complicated. It does not sound complicated. Family, friends, gifts. Ozer laughed and clamped his hand against the side of his stump throne. Quite simple. Xander laughed. This is a human celebration, Ozer. They're not happy unless everything is as complicated as possible. The more misery they can burden themselves with, the more they can blame for staying miserable. Xander glanced over at the Therion leader. Even something as simple as Christmas has its rules and restrictions. It's all about this, well, a lot of beliefs. Beliefs that I just stopped believing in. Ozer nodded. though Xander was sure he didn't understand what he'd said. Finally, he smiled. "I believe that this Christmas sounds fun." Xander smirked. "Maybe you're just a greedy bastard, too." They laughed again, Ozer bellowing harder while Xander's chuckles went unnoticed by even himself. The Therion elder sat forward in his throne, still barking out his cackles, and slapped Xander's shoulder. Even with only one arm, Ozer had enough strength to nearly throw Xander from his seat. Ozer nodded. "Yes, I think I'd like to try this custom of gathering with friends and family." "Gathering with... Really?" Xander scoffed, looking up at his friend. "You gather with the pack every night. Hell, you even celebrate with them at least 4 times a week." "Ah, we do. Ozer nodded as a wide curl stretched the corners of his lips. "But we don't give gifts, do we?" Xander rolled his eyes. "Yeah, great custom." He chuckled and shook his head. "Good luck wrapping your deer antlers." Another wave of bark cackles issued from Ozer, and with them, another series of sledgehammer slaps to Xander's shoulder. "Oh, Xander, your wit is most welcome in our pack." Xander, though no longer facing the Therion, could sense the playful roll of his aura and knew that he was grinning again. "Were it not for your humor, we'd have probably eaten you by now." Despite the playful tone and matching auric signals, Xander didn't doubt his words. "Not much on me to eat, Ozer." Xander cocked his head in his direction and smirked. "Or is that why you have me gorge myself on deer blood every night?" "Perhaps." Ozer's grin widened until he could no longer hold in his laughter and let it erupt from his chest once again. As his most recent bout of full-body cackles died down, Xander watched him suck in a deep breath, the old Therion's face now blood red, and restore his excited smile to his calming expression. "So," he began, his voice still sounding forced from his heavy breaths, "what would you want for Christmas?" Before Xander could even hope to stop it, Estella's face rolled to the top of his boiling mind, her bright blue eyes and exuberant face framed by her short-cut, raven-black hair. The vision was relentless in Xander's mind, and even without the benefit of her physical form, he could feel her passion and intensity, could feel her magic rolling through him as though she was seated beside him. He remembered the love she'd shown him, giving him her body and soul. And then he remembered what he'd told her. "I promise that everything will be all right." He felt his jaw tighten as he clenched his teeth, his fists following suit. From deep within his core, he could feel his aura beginning to whip and writhe with the urge to destroy. As he fought to suppress an outburst, the energy started to turn inward and made him feel like he was being cooked from the inside out. What did he want for Christmas? The question seemed to mock him, and Ozer's impatient gaze grew too demanding to ignore. Xander closed his eyes and let out a long exhale, forcing his body to relax before he did something he knew he'd regret later. "Nothing," he lied. "I got used to not getting anything a long time ago." The night drew on, and though the Therion leader said nothing more of the human holiday that intrigued him so much, Xander knew that he was cooking something up. He didn't fight it, knowing full well that Ozer was a stubborn and aggressive arguer who would ultimately have his Christmas if he wanted it. Plus, the silence allowed him to dwell more on his memories of Estella, and once again left him asking the same questions he did every night. Where was she? Was she all right? And, by far the most persistent question in his mind, Was there a chance he could make things right? Despite her last words to him, could she ever forgive him for not being there when she needed him most? For allowing Lennox to turn her into a vampire? He sighed again and excused himself from Ozer's side, preferring to be alone with his thoughts. Shuffling out of the clearing and under the canopy of snow-covered treetops, he headed for his tent on the outskirts of the Pack's territory, where the trees' overlapping branches blocked out most of the sunlight. Treppis, seeing him start off, quickly followed after, tracing Xander's steps and replacing his smaller tracks with those of the tiger's massive paw prints. He smiled at this and rubbed the tiger's head as it took its place beside him and matched his pace. Though Lennox was long since gone, Xander, having snapped his neck before burying him under the rubble of a collapsing parking garage, he'd left his mark. Just like the year before that, when he'd caught Xander off guard and left him with a blood-red right eye, there was an unmistakable stain on his life. With both his mentor and his lover out of the picture, he had nobody to turn to, no place worth calling home, and no purpose. With the lingering hope that he might still be able to find Estella, he'd stayed, though every part of him wanted to escape, either to some place far from the memories, or simply to reacquaint himself with the receiving end of his gun in the hopes of finally dying. He still felt compelled to drive on, still felt compelled to stay. There is always one more thing to live for, he grumbled his own mantra to himself, feeling trapped behind its meaning. Having nowhere else to turn, he'd sought the hospitality of the Therions, who'd helped him to fight Lennox several months earlier. Despite the nearly unlimited funds at his disposal, both from the now-destroyed Odin clan's private accounts, as well as his and Marcus's sizable earnings as bounty hunters, he'd seen no reason to indulge in anything resembling a luxury. It was with this mindset that he'd established his home. For the first few weeks, he'd spent his days huddled in a small cave, which grew unpleasant enough to convince him to stock up on whatever would make his new lifestyle as a vampire hermit a less miserable one. The tent he'd gotten included several compartments, what the salesperson had referred to as rooms, which allowed Xander to organize his belongings. The smallest section housed several coolers that he kept constantly stocked with super sang juice, a magically charged synthetic blood that his weapons expert had concocted. Despite its name, the stuff was potent enough to keep Xander's needs sated. The next dome-like compartment was bigger and was filled with several trunks that he kept stocked with clothes and supplies. The largest dome, where the simple flap that served as the tent's only entrance and exit, was his sleeping area and living room, where he set up an air mattress, a sleeping bag, and a few pillows. Also inside this were a radio, a device that a majority of the Therions enjoyed listening to, and had even helped the pups begin to learn English, as well as a small space heater. And then there was the notebook. With all of the things that Xander had bought, it was the notebook that he cherished the most. Had the heater blown and set the entire tent on fire, it was this that he would have run in after to save. Since moving into the woods, he'd taken to writing letters to his old friend. He wasn't sure why he did it. They were, after all, undeliverable. Despite this and the many other reasons that existed to not bother with the heart-wrenching task, he wrote in the notebook each morning as the sun was rising. Most of the time, they were nothing more than random thoughts that he wished to share, but occasionally, in the midst of his written rants, apologies and pleas for forgiveness bled through. It was when this happened that he found himself hurting the most. Reaching his tent just as the first rays of the sun peeked over the barren tree branches and through the scattered pines, Xander fought to ignore the itchy warmth as the UV struck the side of his face. Though there was no denying that it was an irritating sensation, it was not nearly as dramatic and fatal, at least in small doses, as the legends let on. Still, while he could find solace in the knowledge that he wouldn't soon be bursting into a pile of ashes, it was enough to urge him to hasten his already purposeful stride. He sighed at the sensation, still petting Treppus on the head, and allowed himself to rub his cheek with his free hand as he finished his trek to the tent. Daring a glance at the sunrise, he watched the golden orb's emergence from the purple sky as he finished scratching the tiger behind his ear, just next to the nick he'd gotten from trying to protect his father during the attack that had taken his life. With the burning itch spreading further across his exposed flesh and the urge to punt newborns growing, he turned his attentions away from the spectacle and opened the zipper to the tent. Beautiful or not, sunlight brought out the worst in his kind. Treppus let out a small noise, not quite a growl or a roar, but an attention-getter nonetheless, and Xander looked at his friend with a smile. "You want to play some more, don't you?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Treppus sat back and raised a hind leg and scratched at an itch. Xander smirked and nodded his head back towards the Therion's camp. "Go then. I'm sure the pups are missing you already." He knelt down and rubbed the big cat's chin with his palm. "Thanks for walking with me." Treppus panted happily as Xander reached gently out with his aura and spoke with him, sharing mental images and basic emotions with the tiger. Soon after, his friend made another noise, happier this time, and loped back towards his Therion friends. He lingered a moment longer outside the tent as he watched the white tiger head deeper into the thickness of the trees and smiled. Though things had been hard, hell, downright shitty, there was something in Treppus's excitement that made him believe that the chaos of his life might finally be over. He smirked as he thought about Ozer and the idea of a Therion Christmas. Christmas, he mused to himself. Finally, with the inherent irritation of the sun's poisonous effects beginning to sink in, he pushed himself through the opening in the tent and headed towards the back for some synthetic blood before starting to write in the notebook.